Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Heartland Capital Strategies webinar series on responsible investing. I'm Carrie Mahelko from Heartland Capital and will be your moderator for today. As you can see from the slide on your screen, we'll be hosting several more workshops over the next year on a variety of topics. Just a little background, in July of 2016, Heartland Capital Strategies published the Responsible Investor Handbook. The book is a how-to guide for pension trustees to realign their governance and investment strategies. Our series takes some of the most important topics from the book, breaks them down into smaller components, and provides a focus on addressing barriers to the greater integration of responsible investment in pension fund portfolios. This is our second presentation today, Responsible Investing and the Labor Movement, a Love Story. A special thank you goes out to Heartland researcher Annie Malhotra for her work on the webinar and the mini book. Today we have three speakers: Tom Croft, our Heartland Managing Director, Keith Mestrich, CEO and President of Amalgamated Bank, and stepping in for Ed Smith, who was called away last minute for President and CEO related duties, is Brian Hale, Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of Ullico. All three of our distinguished speakers will provide their unique experiences and backgrounds on labor and its role in responsible investing. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin. Everyone is muted, but if you have questions, please feel free to use the chat box, which is available on the lower left or right of your screen, depending on the platform you are using. The default setting shows your questions to the entire group, but you do have the option of selecting a name from the list of attendees. I will try to keep track of any questions for the speakers, which we'll address during the Q&A session at the end for all three presenters. If you were unable to join us for the first webinar we hosted, Introduction to Responsible Investing, Tackling Terminology, it is available on our heartlandnetwork.org website. After today's presentation, you'll receive an email with your mini book related to today's content. So to kick things off, I'd like to introduce Tom Croft, Managing Director of Heartland Capital Strategies and Executive Director of the Steel Valley Authority.
Carrie,
Are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
There. Yes, I can. The floor is all yours, sir.
So I wanted to thank everyone who's joined us today. Especially I want to thank our guests and Keith and Brian. And we're really excited to talk about one of the great pioneering histories of the labor movement. So, Carrie, I'm getting a little bit of a echo here. Is that normal? Okay.
Yeah, it is, but I'm not hearing it on this side, so you should be.
Okay. So let me start by saying the obvious. The labor movement brought us the weekend, an 8-hour workday. It brought us retirement funds, but it also has been a huge pioneer in responsible investment. And we're going to get into some background in terms of some of the leaders, institutional leaders of that movement, the Ullico organization and Amalgamated Bank. And so what's happened across the capitals of Europe in the 1850s sort of as a clue to the beginnings of labor investment. And back then we had a situation where the unions in Amsterdam began investing in social housing. That moved to New York City in the 1920s, and we're going to have Keith talk a little bit about that. But let me jump to the decades later when the Department of Labor in the U.S. in 1994 passed what's called the Economically Targeted Investments Directive. That directive essentially helped to commemorate the work that labor was doing for many, many years in establishing responsible investment strategies. So just 2 years ago, 3 years ago, that ruling was confirmed in DOL 2015-1, which also brought the economically targeted investment strategy to the modern day by acknowledging the importance of ESG and responsible investment. So I'm going to jump to our speakers. Keith Mestrick is President and CEO of Amalgamated Bank, where he's been leading the charge since 2014. And Brian Hale is the Senior Vice President and Chief Operating Officer for Ulico. So I'm going to start with you, Keith, and then we'll jump to Brian. So to start with, Keith, if you could tell us a little bit about your history and experience in the labor movement.
Oh, hang on one second. I'm having a little technical difficulty getting Keith back on here. Brian, are you there?
Yes, I am.
There. How about if we start with Brian and I'll get Keith taken care of briefly
Okay.
here.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian, for joining us today.
Hey, no problem, Tom. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. And first want to apologize that Ed Smith, our CEO, wasn't able to attend today, but we had our board of directors meeting earlier this week, and that usually results in follow-up conversations and meetings that have to occur, and he was called away at the last minute. But
Sure.
I think this is a great topic for the times we're living in. And yeah, a little bit about my background and experience in the labor movement. I grew up in a union household. I'm a third-generation member of Labor's Local 386 in Nashville, Tennessee. So I grew up in a union household in the South, which was an interesting experience. I was different than all my friends, but for a lot of my friends, but learned a lot of good lessons around the supper table from that experience. My grandfather was business manager. My father also worked in the trades. My uncles, aunts, all worked in the trades, mainly inside the Labor's International Union. I actually had one of my uncles was killed while working at the calling as a laborer. So
Wow.
say my family has given a lot to the labor movement is a true statement, but also I can say that the labor movement has given a lot back to my family. So we're very proud of that heritage. As I grew up in the sorry, I'm getting some feedback there.
Sorry
As
about
I grew
that.
up.
Yep.
Okay, can you still hear me, Tom?
Yeah, I can still hear you.
Okay. So I was just saying, I grew up in a household like that. I learned early on that I went and got my degree in finance, and then I went to work for the laborers. I knew I wanted to do that. And in my job with the laborers, very much focused around, I had a lot of different roles, but very much did focus around capital stewardship and corporate affairs, because those were, that department was just being created inside the laborers as I was coming on board. So had a lot of activity with that, and very proud of what we were able to achieve there in concert with the AFL-CIO and other building trade unions. But as I was trying to decide where I wanted to go next, I was looking at going to get a law degree, and I sat down with my attorney, our union attorney, and he was telling me, gave me some advice, and he gave me a book to read, which actually is the book that you guys put out, the Heartland Network released, Working Capital, The Power of Labor's Pensions. I read that book, and I looked at that, and I remember reading about J for Jobs, which I knew a little bit about, and reading about other labor-friendly organizations, and that kind of steered me toward getting my MBA. So in many ways, because of that book is why I'm sitting here today, because I spent about 8 or 7 years with the laborers. Like I said, I got my MBA, and then when Ed Smith, who was going to be here today, took the job as the president of Ulico, he invited me to come along with him, and I'm in my 10th year with Ulico today.
That's fantastic. That's great news. And, we never knew when we put the Working Capital book out, it would have such a long reach. But so it's been a gratifying history of that book, and a lot of people still tell us about reading that book. So Keith, sorry about the technical glitch, but let's jump to you. I know you've had a tremendous history in labor as well.
Actually, we're still having
Thanks.
trouble. Are you there? There we go. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
No problem, Carrie. And thanks, Tom, and thanks for the invite. And as I was looking at those pictures of me and Brian on that last slide, I was struck by how old Brian started to look all of a sudden. and much balder on top as well, I must note. But anyway, thanks, Tom, for inviting me to join today. Yeah, like Brian, I too come out of a labor family. My grandfather was a steel worker, proud member of Local 1010 of the steel workers in East Chicago, Indiana. Probably the thing that his work in the steel mills in Inland Steel did was it allowed him to have a dignified career that allowed his children to not have to go to work in a steel mill, actually. And I'm very proud that my grandfather was able to have three children who ended up being a pediatrician, a hospital administrator, and superintendent of the Joliet, Illinois school system. And really because he was able to, lead the dignified kind of life and earn the kind of wages that allowed him and my grandmother to, save some money and do some things for that. And I never forget that. I started my career in the labor movement in the mid 1980s. My first job, I went to work for an organization called the Food and Allied Service Trades at the AFL-CIO, and I'm just looking through this. There's a number of other people who started their careers there as well, but it was sort of the first incubator of really doing corporate research and shareholder action, in the labor movement, and really was a leader in some of the early shareholder initiatives that the labor movement participated on. And then was one of the first people to work at the AFL-CIO's corporate affairs department. Worked in something called the Center for Strategic Research, helping unions work on organizing and bargaining campaigns, really utilizing the best elements of corporate research to think about running strategic campaigns in the labor movement. Right. In the mid 90s or in the late 90s, I was fortunate enough to move to New York and go to work for an old union, but a new union at the same time. I went to work for Unite shortly after the merger between the Ladies Garment Workers Union and the Clothing Workers of America. As many of you know, that is the union that owns the Amalgamated Bank today, and saw that union go through a number of changes. During that time, my own career trajectory in the labor movement changed, and I stopped working on strategic campaigns and really began focusing on the administrative aspects of running a union. Did a number of things there, but really began to think about the power of labor's dollars and how you deployed them. And then spent 5 years as the CFO at the Service Employees International Union before joining the bank 5 years ago now. So that's my strange trajectory to become a bank CEO.
That's great. That's great, Keith. Thank you. So let's flip the order, and our second question is just a sort of broad question of how was organized labor involved in the founding of Amalgamated Bank and then Ullico. Keith?
So a lot of you probably know this story. In 1922 and then subsequently in 1923, the Amalgamated Clothing Workers founded two banks. They founded the Amalgamated Bank of Chicago in 1922 that was owned by the Chicago Joint Board of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America. And then the following year, 1923, founded what originally was the Amalgamated Bank of New York. It was the first labor bank in the city of New York, but was quickly followed by another approximately 30 labor banks that were founded in the city in relative quick succession. Then in 1929, many of those banks failed during the Great Depression, but the Amalgamated, thrived and stayed in business. One of the things I always think about is that the Wagner Act was not passed until 1935. Really providing a legal framework that allowed unions to run elections and organize. And in the 20s, though, in New York City, where there were hundreds of thousands of garment workers, both the ladies' garment workers and the clothing workers of America were doing a number of things to think about how they would actually provide services and organize workers. And a lot of it was being built around meeting the needs that those workers had that were not being met by the structures that capitalism provided at the time. So those unions both founded a number of worker drop-in centers. They founded a number of health centers around the city of New York and the other cities where they were organizing, like Rochester, New York, and Chicago, and in the north in Montreal and a number of other places. They built a lot of affordable housing, which was in dire need and dire short supply in the city of New York. The Amalgamated founded a sister life insurance company called the Amalgamated Life Insurance Company that provided some of the first group life insurance policies that allowed people to insure their lives for a fraction of what it would cost otherwise. And in order to finance it all, they founded the Amalgamated Bank, which really at the beginning did three important things. One is we were the first bank to offer free savings accounts in the city of New York. You didn't need to pay the bank to hold your money in safekeeping. We paid our customers. We had the first unsecured lines of credit that individual workers could qualify for to get that kind of small dollar working capital that they needed, maybe to start a business or to send a kid to school before there were any student loan programs. And very importantly, the clothing workers membership were all immigrant workers who had come from Europe. And, after they left the ravages of the war in Eastern Europe and Western Europe where they had come from, many people were trying to either send money back home to bring their families back to this country or sending money home so people could lead a dignified life in their home countries. And it was our bank that worked with a number of other institutions to invent what ultimately became the foreign remittance system. Those were things that were done to meet the needs of our time, and I think we'll get into some of the other strategies that the bank and others have been involved with meeting workers' needs as time has evolved.
Yeah, great history, and such a rich history. Brian?
Sure, absolutely. It's very interesting to hear the history of all these organizations because they have something in common, which is usually providing a solution for a need at the time. And that's kind of what Ullico's history is revolved around. The first mention of in the AFL minutes of creating a union-owned insurance company that later became Ullico was in 1905, and there's actually a quote in there that talks about in the minutes. It says the present insurance is notorious as a method of exploitation and graft, and has simply become an adjunct to Wall Street. So that was in 1905, but it was interesting. Some things haven't totally changed, but so what they were trying to decide was to find a way for union members to get access to group life insurance. They were being discriminated against. They weren't accessed because insurers didn't want to insure them because they have dangerous jobs, and sometimes they actually have to make a claim. So that they don't want to insure them. So the AFL took it upon themselves and said, well, let's just capitalize our own company. And with a $500,000 loan from the AFL, it took until 1927, but Union Labor Life Insurance Company was created. And to this day, we just celebrated 90 years last year. We have some great pictures of group life insurance policies that have been in place since 1929, 1931, 1933. So to say it's sticky business is an understatement. So we're very proud of that heritage. And like I said, to this day, we still provide that what we were founded upon, which is group life insurance. But if you look at much like Amalgamated Bank, if you look at our history as we've evolved over time, we've had many iterations, many evolutions and product offerings. One of the most important is probably in the 70s, in the late 70s, is when J for Jobs was created. That was actually created in New York City because some of the crafts came together and said, hey, we got a lot of guys on the bench and we got these pension dollars that are sitting on the bench as well. So could we find a way to finance some projects? And that was how J for Jobs was born. It turned 40 years old in November of last year. So in the 80s, during some of the assault on unions, you saw from the DOL, everybody else was leaving the fiduciary liability market to provide fiduciary insurance for trustees. That's when we created our fiduciary liability insurance company called Ullico Casualty. So, and to this day, we're still, I think, seen as an industry leader in providing coverages to trustees that sit on these pension plans, health and welfare funds. You fast forward just earlier in this decade, what you see with some of the unintended consequences of the Affordable Care Act on some of the self-insured plans, with annual and lifetime maximums being taken away. Our stop loss, which is basically reinsurance for those health and welfare plans, became a very important tool to protect those. We say those nickels, dimes, and quarters that get negotiated at the bargaining table into these health and welfare plans. We have to protect those, and that's one thing that stop loss was able to do, and is continuing to do today for those plans. And then, we'll probably talk more later, what we did with our launch of our infrastructure fund, to kind of meet need in the marketplace. So you see like the Amalgamated, you see a very rich history of meeting the needs that are in the marketplace for who owns us.
Thank you. Those are great histories. We know labor was heavily involved in the New Deal and was the driver in the creation of retirement systems and Social Security all around some of those same decades. Can both of you talk a little bit about the ways that labor has been a driver in responsible investing? And let's start with Brian.
Hey, sure. Thanks, Tom. It's interesting. I use many similarities to growing up in the union. My father always told me that many times at the local, he was representing non-union workers as much as he was representing the union workers, because he would set the bar under a collective bargaining agreement, and anyone that didn't want to sign that collective bargaining agreement, they had to try to stay within spitting distance of that, because they were always targets to be organized. I think that in many ways what labor's done for responsible investing is the same way. Calling on the power of all of these dollars that have been negotiated into pension plans across the country and around the world. When we hold those dollars accountable and we remember who the end user, what the whole reason for those dollars being accumulated is, and if you invest in those appropriately, it causes more people to have to act responsibly. What we've seen from capital stewardship programs from all the different unions, we've been intricately involved in that, and what we've seen is opening the door to have relationships with other institutions to try to make them be more like Amalgamated Bank or more like Ullico. And right. In many ways, it's just what we do simply through co-investing. In J for Jobs, we were talking earlier this week, we did about $17 billion in the history of J, but that's just part of the story, because we had $21 billion of other money that co-invested with us. So wow. Our responsible investing is leveraged against $21 billion of other people's money that we showed there's a way to do this successfully and responsibly. And I think we've been able to tell that story effectively. And then you look at what, with our infrastructure fund, it's an even bigger magnifier or leveraging effect, because right. We put about $500 million to work and into about $6.5 billion of enterprise value. So, the labor movement using these dollars, even sometimes we feel like they're large numbers, but in the grand scale, they're not. But when they're used the right way, they tell a great story, they have a great social impact, and they also can affect the way others invest beside you.
Keith?
Yeah, look, Brian, what Ullico's done with the J for Jobs program and now their infrastructure fund is a terrific way of thinking about proactively putting dollars into the market. The Amalgamated Bank has certainly had funds like that as well, but let me talk about a little bit different piece of what we've done, and has really been around our long view funds, which were really named for people to take the long view of investing, to think about creating shareholder value across the spectrum of publicly traded companies in the U.S. and to some extent internationally as well. We have now for almost over 30 years, have had two families of funds that have been broad-based equity index investment funds. One that invests in the S&P family of funds, and another family of funds that invests in the Russell Index. And over time, we have really taken our responsibilities as owners of almost every company in the publicly traded company in the United States to hold those companies accountable to a higher standard of social responsibility and corporate governance standards. Let me just highlight a couple of things, because I think our history on this has mirrored the labor movement's history and how they've thought about the fact that ultimately it's really not the bank that owns those shares, it's our customers who are union Taft-Hartley funds and public funds and endowments who are all desirous of making sure that companies in this country, meet those standards. So early on, I think as people were experimenting with strategies here, we used our position as holding stock in these companies as a way to get worker representatives into a place that they had never been in the past. And that was using the power of the proxy to actually go in to an annual meeting and for the first time, I think, directly confront owners of companies and managers of companies with questions about maybe their labor practices or other social practices that they were following in time. And I think that was the first way that labor was really thinking about how to utilize their power to do that. And we used the fact that we were the owners of those proxies to help the labor movement and workers get into those meetings and confront corporate power up close and personal. Over time, that evolved into a more sophisticated way of filing shareholder resolutions, and that's gone through a variety of different kinds of changes over time, when I think oftentimes started, by just raising the issue in the minds of shareholders around labor rights and social rights around a variety of things, and evolved over time to really try and take on and hold companies accountable, making sure that they were running themselves in a way that was responsible to all shareholders, ultimately recognizing that it was pensioners and other beneficiaries of our funds that were going to get the long-term value out of companies conducting themselves in a responsible manner. We've also been involved in a lot of shareholder litigation that when boards of directors and management of companies have been asleep at the switch, we've used our power as shareholders, oftentimes one of the largest shareholders in a company, to bring suit against companies or to bring derivative actions against companies to hold them accountable to a higher standard of things. And then finally, for funds that have made a decision that they don't want to invest in certain kinds of companies, we've worked with our customers to say, hey, if you don't want to invest in tobacco stocks, or you don't want to invest in a certain class of kinds of things, we work with our customers to design a custom index for their own fund that would allow them to not invest in particular kind of funds. The next evolution really is trying to think about how do we much more proactively invest in the kinds of companies and efforts that Yubico and others have done such a great job of proactively making sure we're putting dollars to work, investing in building the kind of economy that American workers really care about and have a chance to participate in.
Thank you. I'm going to jump off here a bit. We're seeing today a lot of challenges for society, not just in the U.S. but globally. So, and the AFL-CIO and the labor movement have all been focused on addressing some of these challenges. Just a short list would include income inequality, which is growing greater, global warming, and what we see every day, especially with the rise of the gig economy, the exploitation of working people. So let's start back with Brian and just give some thoughts, Brian, as to how you and your institution and the labor movement are engaging with corporations and the greater society today around some of these very difficult issues.
Sure. Thanks, Tom. I mean, I think it's, a lot of times what's wrong, I mean, I'm biased as most of the people on this call are, but what's wrong with America, if you want to go see good people who give back to society, go to a union meeting, and if you sign a collective bargaining agreement, you can solve a lot of problems in our world. So I come from it from that standpoint. But I think as far as engaging today with corporations and society in general, what we've done is tried to be a tool for the AFL-CIO, for the building trades, for any union, to be a door opener with what we do in aggregating some of their funds into our investment products. A couple of examples of that are, when we were called, we went and met with Blackstone. Now, I don't necessarily think of Blackstone as being super friendly to us, but Sean McGarvey from the building trades and Terry O'Sullivan from the laborers, they said, hey, we're going to go sit down with Blackstone, try to engage them to get an RCP document in place for some of the work they're going to be doing in infrastructure. Well, when they were able to come in with their company or with a company like Ullico and say, hey, we're not only here to have our hand out to say you should sign this RCP because it's the right thing to do, but we can show you where it's been done successfully with our assets done through Ullico, and also we're a way to co-invest with you and also provide you financial support for your projects. I think it does tell the story a little bit better for the unions to be part of a partnership with some of these organizations. They were able to get that RCP language signed. And then, we've done the same thing we're in talks with the Carlisle Group now, talking about co-investing, et cetera. So, those are small things, but whenever we can get a few of our dollars with our language represented in deals, most of the time it covers an entire deal, which is good for union workers. So, we've engaged corporations in that way. The community piece is very interesting because I think, we all know that unions, we get very bad PR. Ed always says we have the same people that do PR for unions that do PR for pit bulls, because we don't tell our good stories well enough, and I think we have really good stories to tell. And what we try to do is engage local communities through those local union leaders that sit on these boards, city council, school boards, the water authority. We've been able to do that through some of our project finance to say the union's not coming to you as a on a SWOT analysis. They're definitely not a threat, and they're not they're an opportunity. They're a strength. Let's use them as a strength because they're bringing financing to the table to enhance your local community and to make a viable middle class because you have that collective bargaining agreement in place. And there's some good stories out there. And then as far as just the society at large, we talk about, the reason I came to Ullico was because I want to see companies like Ullico, companies what Amalgamated Bank is doing and others. If we do our jobs well and we ran our companies responsibly, we do the right thing, we're profitable for our shareholders and our stakeholders that represent us, I think that should be the shining star example for the way other companies can operate if they choose to do so. And that's the story I think we've got to tell, and that'll be the benefit to the greater society. As we raise the bar, others are going to have to follow along with us in order to stay in touch, especially if trustees and plan sponsors hold them accountable. I think that's the way we would engage.
Thank you. Keith?
Yeah, let me just a couple of examples, but let me just echo the last point that Brian made. And Larry Fink gets a lot of credit for sending out a letter that companies need to have a purpose on a bunch of things. Well, our two companies, I think, have had a purpose for the entire history that we've been around. And I think that one of the things that's important, Brian hit it on the head. I mean, we need to lead by example, whether it's, both of our companies, have unionized workforces ourselves, which makes us pariahs in our own industry. There aren't a lot of insurance companies and there's not a lot of banks, that have a unionized workforce and deal with, the people that work for them under a collective bargaining agreement. We both pay, we both contribute into defined benefit pension plans, for our workers, recognizing that form of retirement security is still something that's, critically important. And yet, somehow both of us, even with, those two things that I think are oftentimes seen as barriers for companies to profitability, both of our companies, continue to be profitable year after year. And even after we've gone through tough times, both of us after the financial crisis have recovered well and continue to offer those kinds of, benefits to our workers. We talk about a couple of other things that we're doing, one in the world of responsible investing and one more in the world of just our role as a commercial bank. In terms of engaging with society, diversity in the boardroom has become a really important issue. The reality is that, boardrooms in many industries are very, male and pale. And the bank has really now for several years worked with a number of other investors, including the New York City retirement system, to really lead an effort as shareholders to demand, that companies put more women, more people of color, more people from the LGBTQ community, on their boards of directors to make sure that those boards get the representation of thought across the spectrum that allows companies to really make, better decisions. We live that in our own boardroom, and we demand that of the companies that we invest in now. And because of our efforts and the efforts of others, all but one of the S&P 500 now have at least one woman on their boards of directors. We're turning our attention now to some of the smaller cap and mid cap companies to demand the same, and really plan on continuing to be leaders in this effort to make sure that boardrooms are reflective of the society that we live in. It's important, right, that many people can look at corporate leaders and see role models and people that they can aspire to be like. But it's also important that we bring the variety of thought into the boardroom to make sure that our companies make good decisions that reflect the wants and desires of everybody who lives in our cultures. And that, I'm very proud of the work that we've done in that area and done that. But not everything that the Amalgamated does is in the world of being a responsible investor. One of the ways we've tried to engage with the labor movement in particular over the last year and a half or 2 years is trying to lean into the existential crisis that many unions are facing, particularly the government and public unions, as cases wind their way through the Supreme Court, and the potential for the very, very terrific way that unions have been able to collect revenue through checkoff and employers remitting dues is very much at threat. And we've been using the tools of commercial banking to work with any number of unions, from AFSCME to SEIU to the flight attendants and a number of others, to really put in place a mechanism that will allow them to have a process so that if that employer remittance of dues it disappears, that we use the best technology to get individual workers on recurring bank draft payments or debit card transactions or credit card transactions, and really working with unions to set those systems up. And I think meeting the needs of whatever our core constituency in labor has, it's just an important thing that we try and make sure that we do all the time.
Thanks, Keith. It's wonderful to hear the new developments, and every time I talk to you guys or look you up in terms of some of your projects or new developments, I'm always surprised, pleasantly surprised, and I just want to congratulate you both for the tremendous work you're doing. So I wanted to ask, sort of following up with this last question, what do we do about the S and the ESG? I think most of us know that as tremendous the PRI is, now representing corporations and institutions with $70 trillion of assets, that historically there's been a bigger focus on the E and on the G. In other words, the environmental and the governance letters of ESG. We've watched with great interest the human capital framework being developed. That's not the greatest choice of words in my mind, but this framework, which has been led by folks like Meredith Miller and the UAW VIBA and other union pension funds, seems like they're beginning to tie a bigger red bow around the ES and the ESG. And it looks like the CII, the Council of Institutional Investors, is also sort of being brought into this and jumping on board. So we're seeing shareholder campaigns that go beyond, just good human relations policies or HR policies, including some of the things that Keith was talking about, the diversity question of, in terms of boards of directors and pension fund management. So how can we amplify that momentum? And I'll kick it back to you, Keith.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. You couldn't agree with you more. I'm not always sure why G goes with E and S, but it does in the world of investing, things. But if you look at the three letters and you think about some of the things that has happened, it's taken time. But in the G, or the governance part of the world, right? I mean, there are now companies particularly ISS and Glass Lewis, that just, measure companies' performance against any variety of metrics on this thing. And, as, the CEO of a company who has to think about how we compare, to our peers and other things, and just talking with, a number of other people in our industry, yeah, people pay a lot of attention to that because they know they're going to be evaluated on it, and it's going to be quantitatively, evaluated, and it will have an absolute, real impact on their share price and if they're privately held, even on their valuation. And that evolution, I think, has really brought G to a much greater forefront because there's a methodology for measuring performance against this, and companies are being held to that standard and being penalized, if they don't measure up. Increasingly, you're seeing that happen in the environmental world as well, as the SASB standards or other ways of measuring companies' environmental performance are becoming more mainstream, and there are becoming publicly available data sources that people can measure one company against another, particularly in certain industries. I think increasingly companies are being evaluated against a variety of environmental metrics. Not quite to the extent that our governance metrics have reached across the entire spectrum of the publicly traded universe, but increasingly, those metrics are being used to put people on various ESG indices, included in funds and other things. There's lots of controversy around the effectiveness and whatnot of the various measurements, but that will, that's to be expected. We don't really have this the equivalent in the human capital, labor, social space, whatever you want to call it. And I really applaud the work that Meredith and the UAW VIBA have started to do with many others. And I think it's going to require that kind of metric for it to really take hold. I mean, companies are, what in that old adage of what's measured matters. I think we're going to have to get to the same level of that, and that's going to require companies to have to, report these numbers out so that they can be evaluated on it. Hard to do that probably in the Trump era, but the G and the E didn't get there overnight either, and it's going to take some work.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, sure. I think Keith nailed it, and what we talk about, the S is kind of lagging in ESG. What they've done at Amalgamated Bank and through their shareholder, through ownership, and to try to represent the S and try to get good through, try to get to where we need to be. I'm going to take a slightly different angle to it. One way we've always talked about it is because of our position as a leader in fiduciary liability insurance for a lot of these plans. With the bulletin, we worked hard with the building trades and others on the interpretive bulletin that I think you referenced at the beginning, Tom, and trying to, that language is good language. And I think many times we allow sometimes we allow the fund professionals to spook us into making a decision because, hey, if you pay attention to E, S, or G, it could get you in trouble. You got to look at the bottom line. Well, there's good language behind that from that interpretive bulletin and other things that says you need to pay attention to those as a fiduciary. And then we always can echo that because we kind of hold both ends of the rope here at Ulico in many ways because we're going in front of these plans talking about our approach to investing, but then we're also a carrier from their fiduciary liability policy. And I always say anywhere I can talk, we've never had a fiduciary claim for a trustee being actively and engaging in trying to be appropriate with ESG, ES, or G. So, I'm thinking we need to. It's going to go back to what we're doing today and what we continue to do, which is education of our plan sponsors and our trustees, and then sharing our successes, and also showing that at the end of the day, what companies like Amalgamated Bank, Ulico, and others do with our approach to ESG, you're not giving anything up. You're only getting something more when you pay attention to that, and you should take that as your fiduciary responsibility. If you're looking over these dollars that you've been entrusted with, to pay attention to those things. You're just going to get more than what you would if you're just looking at the bottom line.
Thank you. I'm going to combine the last two questions and just to sort of kick it off. Both Keith, you and Ed and the team Brian, at your institutions have had just this tremendous track record in responsible investing, especially in the last few years, and you've generated some very innovative institutions that have been very successful. So I wanted just to give you an opportunity to talk about what your organization is doing today, but also ask you to do a little bit of brainstorming and envisioning and think about where your organizations will be in 10 years and how you think that responsible investment might change over that period. And we're going to try to wrap this up so we have time for a little bit of a few questions. So now, Brian, I think it's back to you.
Okay, sure. That's a big question. So I'm going to try to give you my best answer here. From our perspective, where we are today, we're very proud of where we are, and we think we're positioned well going into the future. The asset management space for us is it's a lot about scale, and we need to be. We're so small compared. We're always the David and Goliath metaphors when we're going up against our competition competing for assets. But we've seen good growth over the last few years. Last year we saw 12% growth in assets at the company, which is a great number. And if we just continue to do that over the next 10 years, we're going to have an asset management platform that's going to be sizable and have even more heft to be able to achieve more of what we want to from an ESG perspective. And also we're going to do it responsibly. So we've looked at many things from product development. We had such a great 40-year history here with J for Jobs, and J kind of has its wind at its back right now. With its returns and a lot of things that are going on there. So we're very excited about the next 40 years for J. What we were able to do with the infrastructure team again. 5 years ago and where we are today, we see that only growing and probably surpassing J in a lot shorter time than it took what it took to get J for Jobs to where it is today, because it's just so it's such a sexy product this time for plans. We're looking at things from regional funds in areas where we don't have as great of union density to potentially doing something there to try to make a difference for what we do as far as alternative asset management around infrastructure or commercial real estate. We think that's a good opportunity. I think responsible investing is going to change over that time. It's kind of what I said earlier. I hope in 10 years it's harder and harder for Ullico and Amalgamated Bank to distinguish itself from its competition, because that means we've brought more people toward the way we operate and do business. That's my hope. But no matter what, I think we're very confident that we're in a great spot to see growth and to be hopefully, as we talked about earlier, we need to be the example that others want to follow. We had a quote this week that the guy who runs Dan Wolak runs our life and health division. He's great at going back through old annual reports, and he pulled a quote out that's pretty timely for this question. It says, this was in our 1927 annual report. Said, "Time and experience will enable us to develop our enterprise to place it beyond our present conception of possibilities." So hopefully in 10 years, we can't even dream of what we're able to achieve, but I know we're going to work hard every day on behalf of our shareholders and the labor movement to do that.
Thank you, Brian. Keith.
Sure, a couple things. One, in the last 20 years, banking has undergone a pretty profound transformation, largely driven by technology. Amalgamated has always been focused on its presence in New York and increasingly over the last few years in Washington, D.C. But at the end of December, we announced the acquisition of a bank in San Francisco, the New Resource Bank, which would allow us to really expand our presence to the West Coast. And my hope is over the next 10 years, Tom, to answer your question, is that Amalgamated, like other commercial banks, really begins to take on a more national presence, with operations not only in New York and Washington and now in San Francisco, but really in other large, epicenters of not only the labor community, but the broader progressive community it forms all of our allies that help support the work that the labor movement does. And that's something we're going to be very focused on, not only expanding ourselves, geographically, but expanding the breadth of products that we offer as well, to offer, not only the complete set of commercial products, but increasingly taking the work that we've been able to do in the Taft-Hartley investment space, and over time expand that so that we can, provide services to, broader types of funds, including public, much more public funds, foundations, and endowments. I'm looking to expand our product set so that individuals who want to bank or invest with a company that shares its values have a platform to be able to do that. And I think you'll see us increasingly do, more and more of those things. And then secondarily, the other thing I think you'll see us do is trying to think much more about not just the sort of passive products that we've had from an investment management perspective, but really trying to have funds that really look like the J for, not mimicking the J for Jobs and infrastructure funds that Ullico so successfully deployed, but trying to fill other voids that exist out there where people are looking to have proactive, impact investments that they can actually make. We've been, in the market now for some time, beginning to raise funds for a fund that would build workforce housing around the country, really meeting a need that is desperately needed around the country, where many, of our members, particularly cops and firefighters and teachers and healthcare workers who have to work in, inner cities that have become, significantly more expensive and are oftentimes priced out of the housing market. Can we use labor's capital to really deploy that to actually put union members to work building that kind of housing, rehabbing that kind of housing, and leaving behind the kind of housing that is desperately needed in so many of our cities across the country today. Trying to, fill voids like that, I think, is something that we need to do. Working, sometimes maybe in conjunction with companies like Ullico, and really working in conjunction with funds who are looking to place their money in investments that can actually, achieve those kind of social objectives over time. I want to see us do much, much more of that.
Thank you. It's been a thrill to work with you guys, and, Heartland's been just blessed to be able to pull together a group of folks around the campfire to try to make our lives better and to renew America. So I want to thank you. I'm going to turn it back over to Carrie for some questions and some final thoughts.
Yes, sir. I did receive a couple questions here. First, Priscilla asks, other than the Human Capital Management Coalition's work, are there any other promising innovations that either of you see as it regards impact investing to support positive labor practices?
Well, look, this is Keith again. The work that many of the people that are on this call continue to do in the labor movement, I think, to try and make sure that these issues are at the forefront of what investors are doing, I think is important. I think everybody is grappling with. I think Tom referred to the gig economy here. I think trying to think about how do we deal with the companies that are coming into that space, and trying to make sure that they as they come up with new social innovations that respond, I think, to significant consumer demand, but fundamentally changes the nature of work that we do. How do we actually begin to respond to that to make sure that workers have representation and other things? There's lots of innovations out there of people trying to grapple with that. I don't think it's yet come into the socially responsible investing workplace environment. And I think unless people on the call are aware of things that I'm not aware of, but I think that's one of the challenges that we'll have to confront is work is changing rapidly. Technology and artificial intelligence and a number of other things are forcing dramatic changes in work. And I think some of the work that we all do is going to have to evolve to respond to that.
Okay, great, thank you. Another question I received, how has the regulatory environment affected your ability to make responsible investments, and how have you worked within it to meet your responsible investing goals?
Well, I think from our perspective at Ullico, one of the challenges we met with specifically our infrastructure fund and the regulatory environment around that is just some of the uncertainty that's come around about how public finance is going to work with funding new infrastructure opportunities, and how private capital can work in conjunction with that responsibly. We've been involved from in the Obama administration, and now even to the Trump administration, in trying to be a willing partner to find a way to, at the end of the day, create opportunities to fund new infrastructure. We think it would be good for not only America, but it's good for the people that we represent, from union members and from a competitive landscape. Unfortunately, there's so much vagary around that. That's been very difficult. That's the reason we've put about $500 million to work. But I see us, what's going on today in some meetings we were having earlier. You're seeing municipalities around the country that are in dire need of funding these projects. They're starting to have to just move ahead without waiting on the federal government for federal support. And we've had some success in doing that, and we're in conversations on water deals at about 3 different municipalities across the country. And that's basically they're throwing their hands up because they're under consent decrees over EPA to try to fix this, but then they don't know how to plan for what any kind of federal dollars are going to be available. And so it's made the job more difficult, but I think also it's created opportunity for labor's capital to play a role of a solutions provider, and to give labor a little bit more of a pat on the back for being part of the solution instead of part of the problem.
Carrie, you want to finish up?
Yeah, thank you. That was all the questions that we had today. Any last thoughts, Tom or Keith or Brian, any of you? Nope.
Thanks for the opportunity. This was great. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Great. Just a few last things on our on the slides. You'll see, we're always happy to promote our Responsible Investor Handbook and what Heartland Capital Strategies is all about. And if you ever have any questions, do not hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you again to Keith Mestrich and Brian Hale, and we hope to see you on our next webinar. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.